Sorry? No, that was wonderful. That actually sounded really good from up here. I have experienced a lot of congregations who do not sing well, who are not among that crowd. Several weeks ago, I preached a sermon here celebrating the subject of skepticism and urging that we give more credit to the proper role of doubting and questioning in a healthy and meaningful faith. Although that sermon focused on considering ourselves and our answers always under construction, this week I also want to acknowledge the difficulty of this challenge. I've been giving a lot of thought to different forms of knowledge, and I wanted to say more about a topic related to skepticism, the nature of certainty and its place in our search for meaning. Have you ever found yourself hungering for certainty, wishing you could just be more confident in your choices and your actions? Have you ever wished to know for sure, for example, that your decision to leave one path for another was the right next step? Have you wished for a reassurance that the values and the causes that you're pouring your life out for are actually making a difference for the better? And perhaps the bottom line, have you wished that you could know for sure that you'll arrive someday at the end of your life filled with gratitude rather than regret for the choices that you've made? As our reading this morning implies, even the earliest seekers to call themselves Unitarians also struggled with questions like these and the frustrating lack of clear and simple answers. Although not all of us might choose the same religious language that James Freeman used 200 years ago in his questions, we can nevertheless sympathize with his desire not only to know the answers, but also to know that we really know the answers, to be more certain in our knowledge. I've been reading the work of neuroscientist Robert Burton about what is actually happening in our brains when we experience conscious or unconscious forms of thought. This researcher explored the electrical activity that occurs when we are consciously thinking and deciding something, but also paid attention to what happens when we're experiencing the feeling of being certain. One of the things that Burton was most curious about is what's going on when we're so certain of something that we reject evidence to the contrary. You may have had conversations with people like this, in which someone simply digs in their heels and insists, "I don't care what you say, I know what I know." That is what I experience every time I go home for the holiday. As is often the case with brain research, we also learn a lot about the mind when we study abnormal examples. For example, Burton looked at cases of what he calls pathological certainty, such as in schizophrenia or paranoia, in which people may feel completely sure about something even when the evidence shows it clearly to be untrue. He also collected stories of everyday people who were absolutely sure about memories that turned out to be incorrect. For example, one day after the Challenger explosion in 1986, a professor had his students write a description of where they were and what they were doing when they had heard about the disaster the day before. 2.5 years later, these students were interviewed again, and many had created significantly different memories about that moment. However, they were absolutely certain of these later memories. When confronted with their original written descriptions, they responded with statements like, "Sure, that's my handwriting, but that's not how it happened." In addition to looking at people who were certain about untrue memories, Burton also looked at what he calls pathological uncertainty, which we can see in conditions such as obsessive-compulsive disorder. I actually experience very mild OCD, enough to create occasional frustrations, but not really disrupt my life. I often feel the need to check more than once that the oven is off, or the doors are locked, or that I haven't forgotten my keys. Even after being presented with the evidence that everything is fine, sometimes I still have to go back and check, or be distracted by worry that I might have forgotten something important or even dangerous. What Burton recognized as he traced brain functions during these moments of memory and certainty is that while our conscious thoughts are centered in the neocortex, the wrinkled surface layer of our brains that's most developed in humans and higher primates, our feelings of certainty are not located there. Our experience of being sure lights up another area known as the limbic system, especially the amygdalae, which are responsible for processing strong emotions such as fear. Burton concludes from these experiments that despite our conviction that certainty is produced by careful, rational thought, this feeling is in fact an involuntary brain state, like fear. Knowing something and being sure that we know it are two separate steps happening in very different parts of the brain. Now, I have to admit that I'm still scratching my head over Burton's conclusions because they seem to question something that I've believed for a long time. One conviction commonly shared among Unitarian Universalists is how important it is that we look critically at our beliefs, even our most deeply held beliefs, or perhaps especially our most deeply held beliefs, and be prepared to replace them if evidence show them to be untrue. But this research implies that it may not be as straightforward as we had hoped. Roger Schenck, another brain researcher working at Northwestern University, further complicates this issue by concluding that we typically make our decisions on a much more emotional basis than we like to admit, and then create rational arguments after the fact to justify these choices. This is how we can insist that we're sure about memories or beliefs that are simply untrue. This is how, when a religious cult predicts the end of the world on a certain date, they don't generally admit they were wrong when everyone is still alive on that day. They simply create a new set of arguments to defend their belief, and they remain completely certain about it. As determined as I am to think of myself as a fundamentally rational being, these scientists insist that we experience certainty in our ideas not by careful thought and conscious choice, but in an unconscious response that is largely emotional. I've spoken before about how grateful I am that my dissertation research allows me to explore subjects that are also really important to my spiritual life. One of the subjects that I teach at the University of Wisconsin is the history of science. And an important theme in my courses is whether we can be certain in our knowledge about the world. For example, the ancient philosopher Heraclitus observed that we can never step in the same river twice. That reliable knowledge might not even be possible about a world that is constantly changing. Over the centuries, thinkers have identified a number of factors that might keep us from certainty. Being misled by our senses, being tricked by malicious demons, or the physical world simply being an illusion. We've wrestled with the same sort of worries in our search for religious knowledge as well. The Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution all gave us cause to think about religious claims with a more skeptical, questioning approach. By the early 19th century, the earliest Unitarians, such as James Freeman, were wondering whether reliable religious knowledge was possible at all. One approach that some Christians have used to make sense of this confusion was a model developed by John Wesley that I've spoken about here before. Wesley identified 4 sources of authority that we can turn to in creating religious certainty: Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. Religious liberals such as Freeman, however, had studied these sources thoroughly and were not yet convinced that they were reliable sources of certainty. For example, one of the ways in which Protestantism distinguished itself from the Catholic Church was by insisting that the Bible is the only source of knowledge that we really needed. The good book, they said, was clear and simple in its message. But this view pushed to its extreme, of course, becomes biblical literalism, making unhelpful and often ridiculous claims about our lives. The Unitarians and other skeptics who had studied the Bible carefully knew that it was filled with ambiguities and contradictions. So how could Scripture, how could this confusing collection of documents be a source of certainty? Wesley's second source was church tradition. Especially among Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, tradition was an important part of people's worldview, and their leaders encouraged them to respect these traditions. But what about the ways in which humanity's needs have changed over the generations? And can't our religious leaders be mistaken? Perhaps other religious leaders. And it's worse, the emphasis on tradition can become, well, we've always done it this way. How could tradition possibly be a source of certainty? The third source, personal experience, is an especially important one in some Protestant traditions. Evangelical Christians, for example, believe that the truth is simple and clear enough for all people to understand without higher education or critical thinking. This brings to mind a story that ministers like to tell about a religious education class in which the children were finishing up their morning together with paper and crayons, drawing whatever it is they wanted while the teachers were cleaning up the classroom and watching their young artists going at it with complete seriousness. One little girl seemed especially intent on getting her drawing just right, and the teacher asked her what her picture was. "I'm drawing a picture of God," she replied. The teacher diplomatically explained, "Well, no one actually knows what God looks like." The little girl firmly responded, "Well, they will when I'm done." The experience of the individual is a powerful source in both evangelical and Unitarian Universalist traditions. But how does any one person's experience become the truth for an entire movement of people? The emphasis on personal experience has too often simply generated a culture of narcissism in which each of us becomes a church of one. How could the impressions of any one individual possibly be a source of certainty? The alternative that we have tended to emphasize in the liberal religious tradition has been Wesley's fourth source, the power of reason. In the rational approach, we insist that religious truth must make sense. That is, it must not contradict itself or other facts that we already know to be true. The most obvious expression of this tradition has been in the success of science and technology. There's no question that the scientific use of reason has changed our lives immeasurably, combating disease, revolutionizing transportation and communication, reducing the amount of labor required to sustain ourselves. But can reason provide this certainty that we're looking for? One of the most difficult points that I have to teach in the history of science, especially to science and engineering students, is that what we commonly call the scientific method does not, in fact, give us certainty. We cannot actually say that something is scientifically proven. The example I like to give my students is the statement, "All swans are white." Imagine that you've looked at 1,000, 100,000, 1,000,000 swans, and every single one of them was white. Your statement is still unproven, because what if there is a single black swan out there that you have not yet seen? It's much easier to disprove a statement like that. All you have to do is find that counterexample, All you have to do is find that one black swan, and it's finished. So reason, or at least science, might produce confidence, but it does not produce certainty. Part of the human condition seems to be that we hunger for this certainty, but it may actually remain beyond our reach. We could suggest a more rigorous or complicated scientific approach in the hope that it would produce certainty, but I think this misses the most important point that I want to make with you this morning. I'm giving the topic of certainty a lot of attention, not simply because it's interesting, but also because there's quite a bit at stake for us as beings who hunger for a life of meaning. I've also spoken here before about my interest in faith development theory, how our spiritual values and our beliefs tend to evolve over the course of our lives. Now, this subject was really important to me when I was a young adult because it helped me to explain why I was finding my beliefs and my values changing. This way of looking at religion helped me to understand that doubt and questioning and evolving beliefs were not a loss of faith, but the normal function of faith. The book that I turn to regularly in this work is James Fowler's Stages of Faith, and it's based on the research of developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, among others. Erikson saw the human lifetime as a series of developmental tasks, each one shaping our life in permanent ways. For example, the basic task of a child's first year is to resolve that tension between basic trust and basic mistrust. The next few years involve the development of autonomy versus shame and doubt, and so on. But it's the final stage of our lives, the final task, that most interests me for the purpose of this service. As we age into our 60s and beyond, part of our spiritual work is to evaluate the journey of our life and how we have spent it. The developmental task that we face in this part of our lives, Erikson calls integrity versus despair. I want to return to the questions that I asked you at the beginning of this sermon. Have you wished to know for sure that your decision to leave one path for another was the right step? Have you wished for a reassurance that the values and the causes that you've poured out your life for are actually making a difference for the better? Have you wished that you could know for sure that you'll arrive someday at the end of your life filled with gratitude rather than regret for the choices that you have made? I think that these are the kinds of questions that make our conversation about certainty most poignant and most important. My experience with people headed into older adulthood plagued by despair is that they have made it into their 60s, 70s, and beyond without having resolved Erikson's task, still convinced that they can be fundamentally in control and fundamentally certain of their lives. And the inevitable refusal of the universe to cooperate with that expectation feels to them like a betrayal at the deepest level. This is why I become so anxious at the state of certainty in American culture. Honestly, who can blame people if they have believed that the goal is to know with perfect certainty, to argue with perfect certainty? Hasn't our political discourse been reduced to the same sound bites over and over, not actually addressing issues, but simply issuing statements in which it doesn't even matter if it's true as long as it's convincing? And hasn't religious talk for many people been reduced to how confidently we can repeat the official dogma, even if we're denying scientific evidence, even if we're denying our own experiences? Who can blame people for having believed that this absolute certainty is the goal? I believe that the antidote to our craving for certainty is to return to the truth again and again that we do not and cannot live in complete certainty about our lives and their meaning. What we can do, however, is build our lives on the foundation of trust and be ready with an open mind when our assumptions sometimes turn out to be wrong. We cannot live in complete control of our circumstances, but neither need we be victims. We can hold fast to those things that we can influence and be prepared when the occasional situation turns out to be beyond our control. What I'm suggesting as an alternative to certainty is a balance between confidence and humility, neither deceived by the illusion of perfect knowledge, nor immobilized by the mystery that surrounds us. We are all works in progress, and even in our last years, we are always under construction. It's good to be in a community where everyone understands that we are all still learning, still growing, and grateful for that blessing. May it be so. And now we'd like to invite you into a time of dialogue.